Mr. Casar from Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think it's entirely appropriate that the Democratic minority on this committee be talking about the potential impeding crash of the American economy and the global economy if the American government, for the first time ever, doesn't pay its bills. I think if anything should be on the high-risk list, that's probably number one, would be if this Congress, led by the Republican majority, forces a default for the first time ever against the American people by this Congress not paying our bills. And so if we want to have conversation here about making sure we don't have tax breaks for the wealthiest Americans or the biggest corporations, I think that would have enormous support here from the Democratic minority. I think it'd be great for us to talk about repealing the last of the Trump tax scam, which we know benefited the top 1% of 1%. Our colleague here, Congressman Jimmy Gomez, recently introduced the 99.5% Act, which would close loopholes on the estate tax and end benefits for those billionaires that continue to avoid paying their fair share every single year. That is, of course, not in Mr. Dodaro's report because that isn't part of your gig, but since it was brought up, I think really important for us to say here that that is an extremely high risk to the American economy and to the federal government if, for the first time ever, folks refuse to pay, the Republican majority refuses to pay America's bills, basically holding things like SNAP benefits for ransom over it, which would take food out of children's mouths and seniors' mouths, and holding things like veterans' health care hostage. One thing, just to get back to my line of questioning here for you, Mr. Dodaro, your report rightly highlights the fact that the climate crisis is having a devastating impact on our communities. In Central Texas, 100-year floods. Now we really call every couple of year floods. We've had 3 of those in the last 10 years. So your report says that FEMA really needs to update its work in order to address things like wildfires and floods. Tell us, would FEMA be able to achieve some of your recommendations and do the work that you all are tasking it to do if its budget were cut by, say, 22%? How would that impact FEMA's ability and other agencies' ability to achieve your recommendations to deal with climate?
Yeah, it would definitely complicate their efforts by how much, I don't know. It depends on whether or not they have carryover money left or multi-year funding that's available. But FEMA workforce has been a particular problem over the years, and we've written a lot about the current gap. They'd have difficulty, staffing if we had, multiple disasters, but they have special resources they can call on. But the biggest issue, though, there on the high-risk list is flood insurance. And given what you said, I'm going to ask Ms. Oris Williams-Browns to talk about what we think needs to be done in the flood insurance area. Oris?
In the National Flood Insurance Program, this is a program that's been on the list for many years, basically following Katrina. It's a federal program, and basically the federal government stepped into the space because there was a lack of a private market, because no surprise, you're quite familiar, flooding can be unpredictable, but flooding is also the great equalizer. And the challenge with the program is balancing affordability with sustainability of the program. And FEMA's been unable to charge actuarially sound rates. They've taken some steps recently to improve the rate setting process, and that increases premiums, but it also makes sure that the premiums reflect the risk of flooding. And this is an area that FEMA can only do so much. It does also require a federal intervention in terms of addressing a number of issues related to the program.
With the goal being you don't want your flood insurance to be unaffordable, nor do you want the program to be insolvent.
Exactly.
And so, I would assume that a 22% cut to something like FEMA would make that even more challenging.
It would make administering the program challenging.
And so again, I think it is entirely appropriate for the Democrats in the hearing here today to be raising that massive cuts to programs like FEMA will make addressing flood insurance harder. It will make it harder to make sure your flood insurance isn't unaffordable, harder to make sure your the flood insurance program isn't insolvent, harder for us to deal with crop insurance as we see our crops suffer from the climate crisis, along with consistent attacks on basic programs like like SNAP, which most folks know as food stamps. We want to make sure that we have teachers in our schools. We want to make sure that folks are able to put food on the table, and we want to make sure that folks are able to be more and more resilient from all of these disasters. We've gone through floods and freezes, gone through the entire electric grid in Texas shutting down, and we need to be expanding these programs, not curtailing them. Thank you, Chairman. I yield back.